Just remember, those people that are vertically challenged hit their head less. Good evening, everybody. This is the Wareham Action Committee focusing on school bus transportation. We have a quorum of 4. Unfortunately, our 5th member, Mr. Andrews, the town administrator, is absent due to illness. We are focusing the agenda as per the last time by starting on the privatization versus Wareham Public Department issue. I'd like to begin because I have been asserting so confidently that I was confident it was the right way to go by offering some numbers to my committee, and then we can continue with discussions. Our transportation manager is here, Jeff Tatro, and will be available to answer any questions that the committee might have. The numbers that I'd like people to consider are the following. The lowest bidder to privatize the system came in, including fuel, athletics, field trips, and late buses, at $2,653,605. If we take the town administrator's preliminary budget, which is $1,341,000, and we said last week that the transportation department feels that if they get new buses, they can operate on that level. And that's a big if, because otherwise we have to use the revolving fund in order to try and replace a small number of vehicles, because it does generate a surplus. If the revolving fund is not available, if new buses are not made available, what happens is the revolving fund couldn't be used to replace buses because it would be making up for a deficit in the operating budget. In other words, the combination of what we get from the town plus the revolving fund creates about a break-even situation for the department. So the good news there is if we get buses, we can use that revolving fund to add to the operating budget, so we don't need any more operating funds. That's the caveat there. But let me come back. So if we take $1,341,000 of operating funds from the town, voted by town meeting, if we add to that $667,000 worth of capital expenditures every year, what is that number? That is the number necessary to create an apples-to-apples comparison with the bid. In other words, it creates a fleet that has an average life of about 3 years instead of an average life of 5 years, because that's the way the bid was presented, and that's why we have to add that amount in order to make it an apples-to-apples comparison. If we then quadruple the vehicle insurance, because these buses are that much newer, instead of averaging, about 12 years, they'll average 3 years. So that quadruples it to a little over $100,000 for vehicle insurance. If we assume that the repairs on the buses continues to cost the same, which is a very conservative assumption because obviously these are new buses and a significant amount of the work might be able to be done under warranty, et cetera, et cetera. If we assume all of that, the difference between the bid of $2,653,000 still remains $476,000. In other words, if we privatized, it would cost the town $476,000 per year just for the luxury of not having to worry about transportation. That's why I think it's so compelling that we can't afford to privatize no matter how much we might want to. Now, how many of those numbers are, call it, questionable? Well, I think I have been quite conservative in the numbers. To quadruple the insurance is certainly conservative. To assume no decrease in the cost to repair the fleet when the fleet is going to be so much younger is certainly conservative. To add $667,000 worth of depreciation expense, otherwise known as capital expenditures, excuse me, Steve, every year is also conservative in the sense that the good news is we don't have to operate the fleet that new anyway. But that's necessary in order to create the apples-to-apples comparison between the Dun & Bus Company bid and the way we would operate it if we were operating it in the same way. So that's where I come, why I'm so confident that we need to move on to discuss how can we fund the transportation business that we are in and need to be in order to save the town $500,000. But having said that, I will open it up to the committee to continue to ask questions on the issue of privatization.
I'll start. I did a little bit of research on towns in the Commonwealth that, since we discussed it the last meeting, that have transportation for K through 6, fees for service, and that kind of thing. And a significant number do.
With respect, although I want to discuss that topic, do you consider that part of the decision-making with regard to privatization?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Because should we keep it in-house, it would be definitely a cost savings. One of the, I kind of had to do a lot of research to find any town, many towns. But one of the towns that did, and certainly this is a much larger town with a much larger pupil or student population, but Plymouth does not charge a fee for students grades K through 6 who reside 2 miles or more from the assigned school. So obviously they are not.
That's because they can't. By law, they can't.
They're not transporting, right, they're not transporting children, well, they're charging a fee for 2 miles or more away. So it doesn't say, but I'm assuming.
I thought you said the opposite. Could you say it one more time?
All students in grade K through 6 who reside 2 miles or more from their assigned school are eligible for free transportation.
Correct.
Free.
By law, okay.
And they just had questions for parents. So what if you do not qualify to ride without paying a bus fee? And the kids that reside less than 2 miles from the designated school, and all students grades 7 through 12, regardless of the distance, are required to pay for transportation.
Yes.
So they still provide the transportation, but they charge a fee.
Correct.
And they have their fee schedule here. It's $125 for the first student, $100 for the second, and $75 for the third. The maximum fee for a family is $300 per year. And they have an advance payment discount. So they have, this is something that they came up with. And I'm just saying that this may be an option.
Oh, I don't disagree. As a matter of fact, that was the next, in my mind, the next item on the agenda. I wanted us to agree as a committee that keeping it in-house and finding a way to pay for it, however, and that certainly could be one of the ways to pay for it, was the next item on the agenda. But if we're still debating public-private, I thought we shouldn't move on to that. But if we're all in agreement that we can't afford to privatize them, now we need to figure out how we can afford to pay for what we want to do.
I'm not entirely in agreement, and I'm not married to either idea. I just, with the private, with the RFP that you keep saying was the low bidder, it was kind of like asking for like the newest buses and the maximal service. If we kept it in-house and we said, okay, to make this more cost effective, we would have these kinds of things in place, fee for service or not providing transportation for a certain student population, those kinds of things. Those are the same things that we could put out in an RFP process. So that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to keep it in-house in order to do so.
Yes, but I think it's reasonable to assume that if you create an apples-to-apples comparison with one scenario, and it's about $500,000 difference, that if you just reduce the parameters evenly for both public and private, you're still going to have a significant disparity between the two comparisons.
But in my mind, we're only having an apples-to-apples comparison if we can't compare our aging fleet and what it costs us for transportation now with an aging fleet, because it's not just the maintenance, because routine maintenance of a newer bus cannot be compared to extraordinary maintenance for a quite old bus. And, those kinds of things. So it's a different cost analysis there, and I understand that you kind of already addressed that. So if we're doing apples to apples and you did an RFP with like newer buses, that would assume that we already had newer buses.
Which would only make the $476,000 that much more favorable, because I assumed that we didn't spend less in the repair and maintenance of the buses. I assumed we spent the same.
Right.
So that made the comparison that much more conservative.
I'm very disappointed, because my hope would have been that Mr. Andrews would have been here tonight, would have attended his regional town administrator meeting and come back with that information, with what other towns are spending, what their challenges are, how they face those challenges. And that's kind of the information that I didn't research, because I had assumed that we were going to have that information this evening. So researching that information, like what's surrounding towns, that's hard to find online.
I've tried. You're right. It is.
It's hard to find.
Mary Jane?
I'm going to say something here that's probably going to blow your mind. But
Turn your microphone towards you.
I would have.
Is it on? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it's on. I would have believed in keeping it in-house like I believe who my mother is. You know that. I drove for 17 years in this system, and I would never advocate for fees or not transporting 7 through 12, ever, ever, ever. But I do believe that and I know you don't want to talk about the numbers that you've shown us, but I believe it needs to be efficient. If I'm going to get behind you and say, okay, I do really believe that the town should keep it. I do. But unfortunately, we're in a situation where the costs are going up. And I don't think the numbers you have presented to us do not support that it's because of the older fleet. As I pointed out to you before, the rise in your cost is not in your supplies, which is where the age of the fleet would show up. It is in other areas. And for me, having the background that I do have in transportation, there are actually 3 or 4 numbers within your budget that would point to an efficient system. I think there are other things we can do, small things we can do, to streamline it before we have to take drastic steps as not transporting or charging fees. You can make less stops. You don't have to go into the neighborhoods. You can bring the children out, make them walk further to the bus stop before they walk to school. You can charge for late buses, okay, so that offsets the cost of the extra stuff to the children, so that you don't have to charge fees to and from daily class, rather to charge the fees to the late bus.
So, just to be clear, even though the budget increases for the last 3 years have been essentially zero, especially if we accept the TA's budget, you're still concerned that we're operating inefficiently?
Only because of the growth, where the growth is, where the growth in the numbers that you presented to us do not substantiate. If the growth was, as you say, was in, I'll just give you some numbers that
Why don't you ask our manager rather than me?
I'll just give you some numbers that I've noticed. I went back to '07, because that's where you said the sped miles increased and all that, okay?
Homeless and sped.
Yeah, okay. But let's go over some difference in where the increases were those years based on the increase for 11.
But I just want to know where you're heading.
Because I think that if we're going to say to the town, this is a more efficient system, and we need to replace our buses, and we need to do whatever it takes to do that, because we want to keep it, because it's the most efficient way to operate, then you have to truly be operating it efficiently. You can't have the growth be in areas where it shouldn't be.
Okay,
And,
but if you're arguing that we could be more efficient,
mhm.
then I say we should be moving on to the next item on the agenda, because if the argument is we could even be more efficient, then the $476,000 that I talked about earlier would only grow. Do you agree with that?
Well, wait a minute, because what you're saying to me is that I'm saying you can be more efficient than 11, which, yeah, I think you can be more efficient than FY 11.
How about 12?
Well, 12 is projected. We don't know what 12 is. 12, just in 12 alone, you have a number projected for your revolving account of 200 and something, right?
Mary Jane, I think we're getting caught up. We
No,
need to...
You have to understand where my head is at.
Time out.
Okay.
And this is a relevancy problem. We can't get into the weeds and never get beyond the first item on the agenda after, and this is now our fourth meeting. We have to try and move on. And what I'm saying is, if your argument is that we can be even more efficient, I'm not even going to dispute that, okay? But if we can be more efficient, that means the $476,000, which is based on the TA's preliminary budget and based on level funding for the last essentially 4, 5, 6 years, that only means that number is going to get larger, and the ability to privatize gets even smaller. So if I'm happy to have you give us reasons at another time for why that number should get even larger, why privatization is even a worse idea than my calculation. But we don't have time for that if we're going to be an action committee.
But unfortunately, I cannot advocate keeping it in-house if we're not going to be assured that it's going to be kept efficient. You know something, Jeff? Wait a minute. I'm just going to give you an analogy. I can pay someone to clean my house, and I can pay them $100 a week, and I can say, you know what, I'm going to clean my house myself. And I can go out and spend $150 on supplies. Well, did I save any money? Even though, in theory, it should be cheaper for me to clean my own house, doesn't mean that it will be. It depends on how efficient I am.
But if you said to your cleaning lady, you're doing a fine job now, but I don't have confidence you're going to continue to do a fine job in the future, so you're fired, wouldn't she scratch her head and say, why are you predicting something negative for the future?
That's not equal, because what we're not predicting that it's going to get worse. We're predicting that it's cheaper. It is cheaper for me to do it myself.
The past and the present are almost $500,000 less than if we privatized. If you want to argue that we can do it even more cost effectively, that's great. I'm happy to hear that. But that only means the argument not to privatize is stronger, and we need to move on to the second item on the agenda finally.
Okay.
Ellen.
I would like Mary Jane to be able to finish a thought.
Okay, because
So-
I'm going to tell you right now that if I think that if we just go blindly into this and say, okay, let's buy buses, and then we don't watch our cost, which can easily happen, we'll
but-
find ourselves in a situation where we're charging more than we're end up costing the town more than a private contractor would have. That's my point. That's my whole point.
Are you therefore advocating that we should bid this out annually?
No, I'm advocating you need to move with caution. You need to move with caution, and you have to get the town behind you to believe that it is going to stay efficient, that it will be watched, that we won't let it go blindly into oblivion.
So 5 years in a row with no increases isn't a trend.
Well,
I don't think so.
how many, do we have 600 fewer students than we did 5 or 6 years ago?
No.
How many, what's the
We peaked-
population of students done in the last 6 years?
My memory, and this is off, but it's a pretty good memory because I did the analysis myself. My memory is that we peaked about 10 or 12 years ago at about 3,500 students, and we are now about 3,000 students. So over the last 10 or 12 years, we have lost about 500 students. That's correct. Not 4 or 5 years, twice that long. Yes, that's correct.
But, so the number of students has decreased.
Yes.
So, I mean, so when you're saying that you've had 0 increases, if the number of students has decreased, It's more of a, it's level funded, absolutely, but the number, so the cost per pupil has
Risen.
increased? Is that what you're saying to me? Because that's what you mean by saying
By
zero
definition, the
increased.
cost per pupil has increased, and that is the problem of fixed and variable costs.
Mm-hmm.
When your fixed costs are relatively high, and obviously buses are a fixed cost, it's only when you can actually reduce the number of buses that you're using and therefore the number of drivers that you can significantly decrease your cost, which gets into the second issue of reducing services that I think is a very relevant topic. But we can't get off the first item on the agenda. Barry?
I've been trying to sit and listen carefully over the last 4 meetings. And I think I've heard tonight all 3 people with reservations say that it's cheaper to keep it in-house, but it can be done more efficiently. Yes, we have to look at the trends. We have to look at how we're going to pay for it. To answer the questions about why is it more expensive with less students, there are all kinds of reasons. Special ed, where we send people. Mary Jane, you can shake your head as much as you want. Please let me finish my concept.
Finish, I
All right.
open my mouth.
Let's be civil to each other.
The issue that was brought up, I don't know how many now years ago, about the safety of the vehicles. I don't think anybody can argue with the fact that we have 25 vehicles that are over 11 years old and we need to replace them. We have a problem with finding funding for the transportation system. We live in a community that if we do not transport children, our attendance will go down. That's a fact. Now, what's also a fact is we can only provide what we can afford. I understand that. I'm willing to have those hard conversations about bringing forth fees, reducing services, whatever we need to do so that we can replace our vehicles, so that we have newer vehicles on the road that will cost less to repair, so that we won't have to have the part-time mechanics. But to do that, we need to move on to the next part of this, which is what can we afford and what do we do next? If we can only afford X, how do we get our services to match? We've actually started, in fact, last year Mary Jane was here, we started transporting students that we never transported before because parents had been asking for it for years, those that were actually closer than a mile, because of sidewalk safety issues and so forth. So we've actually we put more kids on the buses for transportation. Maybe we can't afford that, or people have to pay for that service. But to get to that conversation, we need to get beyond the privatize or keep it in town and then get into, okay, what can we afford? How are we going to pay for it? And what does that mean? And then it's the school board that's going to have to make the decision about fees. We were there before. I don't know how many years ago it was, but we had that conversation. I worked up the numbers. Mary Jane was part of it. And it doesn't bring in as much as we would wish it would, because a number of people, and Ellen, you brought it up, economics are hard, and carpools will be formed and people will be dropping off, and that isn't the best choice, but for some people, it's what they're going to do when fees are charged. And I understand that. And we'll have to look at how many kids are on the bus and make it as efficient as we can. But with all due respect, any questions about efficiency are not in line for this group at this time.
But in your opinion, but I think that every person has to be heard. If we're all asking for information, they're not trick questions. Give us as much information as possible. If people are watching this, and I hope they are, because I'm shocked that the attendance is as abysmal as it is, because this affects all of us. It affects the students. It affects, there's been talk of debt exclusions, overrides. This is a hard, tough economy. I'm preaching to the choir. I know that. I get it. But we're also, people are trying to figure out how to keep their homes, never mind have increased taxes. They're trying to figure out how to live paycheck to paycheck. People who used to donate to the food pantries are now clients of the food pantries. So there is no way that you are going to see me stand up and hold my hand up and say, I'm for an override. I'm not going to do it. I cannot do it, not in good conscience. So when we talk about efficiency, what we're saying is we've heard for years that municipal maintenance is at its absolute bare bones, but they still have the same number of people knocking at their door. They have more potholes. They have so much work. They're so grateful that we've got citizens that are getting involved in picking up litter. So we have multiple town departments that are decreasing services. So I don't think it's unreasonable. Granted, we are talking about one of the most vulnerable populations that we have, and it's the children. But we also have a vulnerable population, and it's the elderly. And we don't provide the services that we had hoped that we'd be able to provide for them. We have limited fuel assistance for them. So I know it goes across the board. So when we say efficiency, we're saying, do we make every dime, every penny, every nickel count the way people in their homes are looking through their couch cushions, looking for the loose change to get the loaf of bread? So I think that it is very pertinent discussions for this particular committee.
The only reason I'm questioning the pertinency is not because efficiency isn't always a critical issue and saving tax dollars isn't paramount, because there are just too few of them. The only issue is that the first item on the agenda is privatization versus staying as a public department. And if we held a vote on that, forget about what your vote would be. Are you prepared to even answer that question? Yes or no? And if the answer is no after 4 meetings, then I think we need to table it and move on to the second item. Because if there was consensus in either direction, the second item would then become far more important, because privatization or public, we can't afford either one of them with our current revenue stream. So I'd love to get to the issue of how do we afford to transport our kids, even if we limit the number of kids that we transport, because that's the difficult subject as compared to privatization or public, because we can't afford either one. So that's why I think we perhaps ought to table the first item on the agenda and just move on to in some ways, the more relevant one, which is how do we afford either one?
Right. And I agree with you.
Okay.
Because at this point, I really don't think that I think that it's too big for the financial situation to just make it as simple, black and white, privatize or keep it in-house. Because at this point, if we keep it in-house and address the concerns that Mary Jane is bringing up, because she's much more familiar in looking at these numbers, we utilize Mr. Tetro's expertise and see how we can afford what we have. Because if we say I'll leave it at that, because if we're going to go on to the next item agenda, then we can get into it.
Well, first I want to say that I don't appreciate anyone paraphrasing what I said, okay, or trying to interpret what I said and say that whatever. And the second thing is that actually we used to transport those children, and then we stopped transporting those children, and then we went back to transporting those children that Barry was talking about within the small area. I think that happened when the 6th graders moved up to the middle school and there wasn't room on the bus. I'm really not sure. And the third thing was, what I was trying to point out with the numbers was a trend, but you wouldn't allow me to point out that the trend seemed to reverse in 11, which is why my concern comes about keeping it efficient.
Can we move on to the second item on the agenda?
Yep.
Okay. Now, before we do, I'd like, for full disclosure, to let you know that there's an item on the school committee agenda for tonight, literally in an hour or so, where the school committee will be voting. There have been no preliminary discussions. This is something put on the agenda. I approved for it to be on the agenda, but it was put on the agenda by the superintendent for a debt exclusion article for this coming town meeting. From a timing point of view, that was necessary. You should not assume that because we're discussing it, or even that we're voting on it, that necessarily means that we have decided what should be done. It's more a question of, if you are going to remove services from a community, which if you stop providing for grades 7 through 12, if you started adding fees to something, which is another thing that a community would feel, to give people a choice about whether they want to pay extra, the community as a whole, which is what a debt exclusion would do, versus having the end users, i.e. parents, children, paying, it seems to me is a rational approach in a democracy. So just because you put a debt exclusion on, and only the Board of Selectmen, as you know, can put one on, just because you choose to put a debt exclusion on the ballot doesn't mean you necessarily even support it. All it really means, literally, is you support the voters having the right to choose. Now, you could argue that leadership says, no, I'll make the decision for my constituency. That is a form of leadership that I can respect. But I just wanted it to be clear that the item is going to be discussed on the school committee agenda tonight. Nevertheless, I think, speaking personally, only for myself, we would be remiss as a school committee and as an action committee if we didn't discuss what should be done if the voters said no.
We've discussed that.
Right.
Plan B.
Because the odds of people saying, even if it's only $30 a year for the median taxpayer, that's still $30 a year that I've got to find that I have allocated somewhere else. And therefore, when I go to the voting booth, I'm going to have to say no. And if a majority of the people say no, that means we have to go to Plan B. So to reiterate Plan B, first of all, we're all advisory when it comes to things like debt exclusions and overrides, but the school committee has the ultimate responsibility to decide on Plan B. So in this particular case, the action committee is acting as an advisory body for those of us associated with the schools, and we will take it back to the school committee. But just as to recall, and then I want to hear people's thoughts, the possibilities if the debt exclusion is not approved basically comes down to the following: reducing services, which by law can only be done for grades 7 through 12, or adding fees, which can only be done for grades 7 through 12 and K through 6 that are further away, closer than 2 miles, and cannot be done for anybody that's benefiting from the free and reduced lunch program. Our tentative number of children that would fall into that category is a little over 1,100 students. In other words, only about, call it 40% of the students would even be eligible, and then we'd have to hope that they would decide it was worth it. What that fee would be is an interesting thing to interesting is the wrong word because I hate the idea in general, but it's like taxes. The more you charge, the more people don't pay. In other words, they try to find a way around it. If you made it, for example, 50 cents a day, it's much more likely that a parent would say, okay, for 50 cents, I'll put my child on the bus. If you made it $2 a day, the family might say, over my dead body, I'll use carpools, I'll do anything to avoid $2 a day because that's $400 a year, $360 a year. So I think we need to be careful about that. In terms of just one more vital piece of information. If you reduce services, 7 through 12, that's the maximum amount you could reduce services. Everything else is required by law. You eliminate 13 buses from service by doing that. You end up with runs of to the east for elementary, to the west for elementary, and then a middle school run. The middle school run is a much smaller number of buses than the east or west run because the number of children is much smaller. One of the compromises would be to say we'll continue to provide service to 7, 8, and 9, even though it's not legally required, because the bus is going there, the kids literally might be brothers and sisters, and although you would increase the number of drivers you had to employ, the number of buses that you could take out of the fleet would still remain the same at 13 because the size of the run, because of 3 tiers, stays the same. With respect to, and then there's one other option that we can't ignore, and that is doing both in some fashion. In other words, you could have a relatively low fee. We were initially contemplating about $1 a day. You could cut that to 50 cents a day and also reduce services for just the high school. The combination of the two, plus splitting the meals tax between busing and the town, would allow us roughly to operate the fleet at a reasonable level of newness. In other words, we'd be able to buy some buses on an annual basis because of the approximately $200,000 we'd be getting in capital from the town and the additional fees and money we'd be saving by reducing the fleet and charging fees. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
Jeff.
I was all ready to stop.
Your $1 a day is more expensive, because it's 180 days?
Yes.
It's more expensive than what Plymouth charges, right? I mean,
It
so
turns
you're
out-
saying that it would have to be $1 a
No,
day
I'm not
because
saying that. I'm
this
not
says-
saying that at all.
so their fee schedule, and I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, but it's $125 for the first student, and then $100 for the next student, and $75 for the third student in the same family, which is significantly less than $180 for 3
student.
children in a family.
Turns out that $1 a day, roughly, is sort of low average for the Commonwealth. You're right, some are much lower than that. If I was waving my magic wand, I would want it to be lower than $1 a day for 2 reasons. One is, that's expensive, especially if you have multiple children. And number 2, I think it will discourage people from even putting their kids on the bus, and so our estimates of how much we'd collect would be off, and we'd have to adjust things the next year, for example. So I agree with you. Plymouth is lower, and I would probably, if I had to be advocating, but right now I'm not in the position of advocating, we're really in the position of discussing and making the town aware of what we're thinking.
But has Mr. Tatro worked with you, Barry, to kind of come up with what that would look like, Plan B, with one or all of the elements if we kept transportation in-house? Like fee, decrease of service, but, kind of isolating them out to see what that looks like, and maybe then the combination of all.
Right. We have discussed that. We've begun planning. We have talked about a 3-tier system where we get to use the same buses 3 times. Both elementaries would have to start at different times. They couldn't start at the same time, which means you have all your buses in use. So we'd have 3 tiers. So yes, we have had those conversations, and then we have to figure in what you're going to get, as Jeff said, from the fees as well as, reduced service.
Right.
So
Now,
the answer is yes.
Short answer is yes. Now, does the school, and pardon my ignorance, I haven't had children for years in the school system, but way back in the dark ages when they were in the school system, we had to pay back then for athletic events and those kinds of things for my boys to be transported to and from. Does that still exist?
We have athletic fees, and they basically go to pay for transportation, yes.
So are there any other fees that are paid by the student body that would be relative to this situation? So it's just athletic events? But what about field trips? Kids
Yeah.
still take field trips? Those kinds of things?
Normally, though, for instance, at the elementary school, it's the PTAs that pay for the buses for field trips.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have them in the budget, or we have a very small amount. And some teachers get grants to take field trips. But you're right, if you're going to go into the Museum of Science and there's a $5 charge, then normally we ask parents to pay for that.
Right. So I've been out of it for so
But
many years.
athletics is the biggest.
But athletics is a huge one.
Yes.
It's a huge one because the price of fuel, the price you have to pay the driver, and the wear and tear on our poor buses. But I'm thinking in terms of like 13 of the absolute worst buses coming out of the fleet, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, this would be, if we made these changes, my hope is that in the next couple of years, the economy is going to turn around. That's my hope, but, you know, everybody can dream, rose-colored glasses, that kind of thing. This, as Mary Jane said earlier, there was a time that with the children that live close to the schools, you did not transport them to school, but now you do. So then it's going to go back to, now you don't. So do any of us want to see any of these things happen? Absolutely not. But we have talked after a couple of these meetings, Jeff, and I've said, you know, Plan B. You've got to have Plan B. Because when we're all being told that the infrastructure has fallen down around our ears, from the school side and the town side, we're looking at like millions and millions of dollars for capital items throughout the town. And
Yeah, the buses are the tip of the iceberg.
But it's real. I'm not saying that it's not a real issue. Believe me, they have to be. If I could wave my magic wand, we'd all have as much money as we could possibly need to pay for everything that we want for our children. But I don't. And I also don't have a magic wand for the other parts of the town that need attention. I just don't. So we all knew the tough decisions were coming down the road. And we just have to have Plan B. And unfortunately, I really think from the number of people that have spoken to me, that for many people, Plan B is Plan A.
I want to come back to that, but I want to
Okay.
ask Mary Jane.
I
what
want to
she-
ask some questions, not because I need to know the answers, but because I want the public to know the answers, okay? Because there's a lot of other stuff going on here when you do that kind of a three-tier system that we aren't talking about. Like, okay, I'd like a better picture of how it would look. Are you going to use 10 buses? That's what you're talking about? You're cutting out 13. You're going to.
Would you do me a favor
Oh,
and ask
yeah,
Jeff?
okay. So we'd be using 10 buses? Am I right?
Push your button.
Is green?
already on.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the original write-up involved 11 buses
11
for
buses.
the elementary levels and 6 for the middle school.
Okay, so you're basically saying 6 drivers would drive 3 routes?
That's correct.
And then the others, okay. How many hours a day would those 6 drivers get?
They would be a little bit more than they get now, but without having finalized start times at any of the schools.
No,
Um,
that's,
I think we figured it'd be roughly 4.5, I think.
okay.
And I could be off. We did figure this out, not just the
Jeff?
one spreadsheet I
No,
didn't
it's
take.
okay, I'm just
No,
rough
I want
estimate.
you to continue, but Barry had a,
All right, and I believe that the 6 that we're talking about that now currently have midday, by going with a full-day kindergarten program, we won't need middays, so it won't be adding.
Okay,
All
so
right.
you would be able to eliminate all the midday buses?
That is correct.
Wow.
So you know exactly where I'm going then, because you know that I'm gonna ask about benefits.
Right.
Right, okay, so that's what I'm saying, I'm just making sure that you've looked at all of it.
it was
so-
high on our list of questions, too.
Okay, so now, what will we do about the late buses? Oh, yeah, okay. So how will you deal with the late buses? You're gonna have 6 drivers doing the middle school students, and you're gonna have the remainder of the drivers doing elementary runs. In the afternoon, those 6 drivers would take the middle school students home, and then they would have elementary runs to do. So who would come back for the late buses, because they would have 2 elementary schools?
Well,
not
that's
one.
that's something we'd have to tweak.
Okay,
Perhaps the late buses are actually now later.
okay.
That's right now I anyway have only focused on our primary routes and on getting our kids to and from school. So
Just
I have not considered late runs, but it probably just would have to be later.
Just a question.
Barry.
Do you
As
charge
a
for late buses?
As a potential answer to that, we have been looking at, as you're well aware, we have multiple activities after school. The YMCA has programs, Boys and Girls Club have programs, we have our care program, we have tutoring programs, and we are trying to look at having like an after-school, summer school person that plans all of it, and it goes in a booklet, kind of like the YMCA, So if you want your child to stay for tutoring after school, and then play intramurals, and then maybe go to the care program, so that maybe we can eliminate the 3:30 bus and we only have the 5:30 bus that is paid for by the grant.
Oh, I was just going to ask that, if that
Yes,
was
that
subsidized
is,
in any way.
it is paid for totally. In other words, they pay
That's
for the
great.
driver's salaries, gas, and so forth.
That's great. I was just going to ask if there was a possibility for the subsidy for that, but, yeah.
So, one of the fundamental questions that I think the committee should consider is Plan B Plan A? Or should it be a Plan A, and when the voters decide, we either have to implement Plan B, or we can put Plan B aside until maybe never have to use it? Is there any thoughts on whether we should even give the voters the opportunity to maintain the status quo by spending a little bit more money? Yes.
I would never deny the voters an opportunity to express themselves. Absolutely not. That's certainly up to the voting population.
Well, it's up to your committee.
Well, I find...
I don't mean to pressure you, but I mean, that's the law.
No, and I understand that. But, I mean, it would be no different than, I personally feel that if it came to us to put a question on the ballot, that we would have to put that, I would feel obligated to put that question on the ballot. I may have strong feelings, and I may want to debate the issue, but that's not, this isn't a dictatorship, it's a democracy. So I understand that, but my personal opinion is, I think Plan B should be Plan A. And I think that you have to go back to the school committee with this. Certainly, of course you are. But having something, having the, I don't know what term to use, I guess I'll just use business plan, but what that looks like. Because none of us want to decrease services in any way. But as I said, I did some research online, I couldn't find a whole lot of information. But what I did kind of Google fees for bus transportation in towns in Massachusetts. Whoo! Unbelievable number of towns came up. In fact, I was surprised. And the more affluent towns absolutely charge fees for school transportation, which really surprised me because they must have a significantly larger tax revenue than we would ever even hope for.
I suspect the reason is in part because when you have a little over 50% free and reduced lunch, the fees you can generate by even having a fee program are diminished, whereas if you're a wealthy community, you know if we charge a fee, you're probably going to get it.
Oh, they're absolutely getting their fee.
Right, exactly.
So the wealthier communities are getting their fees, and I just thought, well, shot in the dark, I've got 10 minutes, I have to leave, because I just kept trying everything, trying to get the information. It's not easy, as you know, it's not easy information to obtain. I don't know, we do need to do something. We all know that. But I just don't want to go in there with only one plan, go into town meeting or to the voters with only one plan without an alternative. And I don't see myself debating favorably for committing the town to purchasing 5 new buses in perpetuity. Don't see it.
Okay, so to summarize, it sounds like what you're saying, and then I'd like to hear others speak as well. It sounds like what you're saying is, while you wouldn't advocate for 5 new buses in perpetuity through a debt exclusion override, whatever additional process we generated new funds, but you think the voters are entitled to make that decision.
I do.
But a Plan B that involved a combination of fees, which the school committee would have the responsibility of developing and then making everybody aware of that it existed as a Plan B. A Plan B that consisted of a combination, perhaps, not necessarily a combination, but it certainly could, reduce services, fees, and some portion of the meals tax. I know the town administrator, if he was here, would say, yes, you've got 100,000 of it this year for this coming year, but some, hopefully, significant chunk of that meals tax, the combination of those 3 things.
I didn't say number 3. You said number 3.
Good. So we can debate that. But my point in saying that is, if we're solely reliant on reduction of services and fees, then that has to produce that much more in revenues so that we can in fact replace the fleet, even though the fleet will perhaps be smaller because we'll be reducing services.
Well,
But we still
significantly.
need to do that. And so we're not avoiding replacing buses, we're simply finding another way of getting the money to do so, rather than through extra taxes. So the only problem you have with what I said was half of the meals tax. Okay. Is it the half that's a problem, and you'd like a different number, or do you have a problem with any portion of the meals tax going to the buses?
I really haven't thought about it till you brought it up this evening. And
The only
I
reason
guess-
I mentioned it is because we'd probably have to increase the fees that much more, reduce the services that much more if we didn't get a significant portion of the meals tax.
And I understand what you're saying. Believe me, I do. However, it's very difficult for me because, and you've heard me use this argument before, please don't even misrepresent what I have to say. I am not marginalizing the 3,000 students that are here in the town of Wareham. But what I'm saying is that there's, over 20,000 people, that includes those 3,000 children, and then it expands to 40,000 people in the summer that also deserve to have the rest of the town's issues addressed in some sort of significant way. So right now, I'm hard-pressed to allocate even more funds. I am. I mean, that's just the way I feel about it now. And I understand where you're coming from. Believe me, I do. But there's also the town side that those things have to be addressed. And I'm also thinking about, we're talking about the school buses and how do we continue to afford to have them, is what it all boils down to. We can't say, no, we're not going to have them in-house, and no, we're not going to privatize. We're just not going to have them. We can't say that. But I'm also thinking in terms of, you've got a leaking roof, that if it continues to leak, it's only going to increase the damage, just like anything else, that if we don't address it as soon as possible. So I'm looking at other things that may have started out small 10, 20 years ago that are causing significant damage. Mr. Flaherty sitting here in the audience, the library comes to mind, that it may have been, a little bit of chip paint a couple years ago, and now it's significant damage to the structure of the building. So there's other things that need to be addressed as well.
Couldn't agree more. What makes the buses so difficult is because it's a recurring
Yes.
capital expenditure. I mean, at least we might have some confidence that if we put a new roof on the gymnasium in the high school,
It'll last for a while.
it will last for a while. But here we're talking about 5 buses in perpetuity, and that makes it a very difficult issue. I'm also, when I passed by one of the local newspapers and saw that they were the top item on the agenda was a $6 million deficit,
I saw that.
which I think means that the citizens are extremely aware that we've got a very difficult fiscal picture for the foreseeable future. I think they're expecting sacrifice, and I think they're expecting thoughtful leadership. The real issue is, as usual, to make sure it's as fair and as evenly distributed, that is, the pain and the sacrifice, as possible. But Mary Jane, any thoughts on the Plan B?
I can't advocate to cut services to 7 through 12. I drove too long for that.
How about 9 through 12?
Not
So you are advocating to make the fees as high as possible, or are you just simply saying you'd vote for the debt exclusion?
Personally, I don't think Wareham can afford fees. That we never had fees, and that's why. Because we never thought they could afford it. We tried to run as efficiently as possible because we didn't want this day to come where we got to the point where we either had to cut transportation for certain grade levels or charge fees. And it's a tough decision, and it's a sad day when we don't transport all of the Wareham children to school. I can't get behind. I'm sorry, but I can't get behind that. And as hard as it is to say, I think it's the people's decision to make, and, you know, hopefully the parents make the right decision, but.
I would like to suggest the following, that the first item on the agenda for next time should be Mr. Andrews talking about what we hoped he would be talking about this week. Because if he's sick, does that mean he didn't get to go where he was going to go?
No, but he can, I'm sure that we could encourage him to make
Okay,
some phone calls.
I'll leave it to you to encourage him. And then the second item on the agenda will be a presentation by Mr. Tatro, or perhaps Anna or yourself, not me, on what Plan B would look like and what combinations of things we could possibly do, and how much they're likely to save, and what the impact are on parents and children and the community. I think we need to really flesh that out so that the community understands exactly the impact, what the impact would be when they're deciding whether a debt exclusion makes sense for them. Yes.
As someone who, we didn't have school buses. I grew up in the city. We used public transportation. We had school passes. We had elementary schools. We walked to them. I mean, they did not transport anybody. We had elementary schools probably within a 2-mile radius that we walked to. Is there any possibility, is GATRA considered public transportation? And if so, no. Is there, so there's no way to
I don't believe so. I don't think it would.
have any kind of discounted services for
Regulations.
them with, so if they're not, that was my point, because if it was public transportation, it would be a non-issue.
I'd have to look at that. You're right, in the city of Boston, they do give vouchers, or they pay for that.
We had a
for
bus
some
pass, like a photo
transportation.
ID.
That's right.
A lot of towns do that, like Randolph does it too.
You know, if you have an adequate public transportation system. But where some of our students live, you don't see buses for miles.
But that's true of Plymouth. I mean, I was really quite surprised, because Plymouth is very rural. I mean, they said 2 miles, so I'm sure that, you know, kids that are out in the sticks are definitely not getting on a school bus. But they also, there aren't sidewalks everywhere. So I was a little surprised. That came as a surprise to me that they did not transport students.
I think I can confidently say the following, which may be obvious, but it's probably worth saying. If the town decided, the school committee decided to reduce services, and therefore the cohort of eligible students to ride on the bus was reduced, if you're no longer eligible to ride on the bus, then how you get to school is your parents' responsibility. And therefore, if the parents put their child on a GATRA bus, that's not the school committee's responsibility, because
No.
we've simply said they're not eligible.
No, I understand what you're saying. That's why I want to know if it was public or a private transportation service, because as I said, there's still kids. There's kids that are taking, you know, public transportation. They might take a train and then a bus, etc., in the cities. So they're getting on there on their own. They're not there with their parents. So I'm not saying that they should be getting on a GATRA bus. I'm not saying
I know
that
you're
at all.
not. You're just exploring ideas.
Right.
And I guess my problem with the whole situation is safety.
Absolutely.
And what we know statistically is the safest way for a child to get to school is on a school bus.
However,
having
other
just been
towns,
told-
other towns have made this tough decision.
Yes. But I
This
was
is
just-
not an easy decision. None of us are sitting here flippantly saying, oh, this is what we're going to do, and oh, well. Every person that's sitting at this table is agonizing over any decision because they're all hard.
I must confess, I was walking my dog, and a neighbor just said to me, by the way, did you know that a level 3 sex offender just moved into your neighborhood?
Oh, yeah, that's been in the paper.
And personally, I don't care. But I care for every child and every parent of every child in my neighborhood. And so, well, as much as I enjoy Dick Paulson and his desire to have everybody walk everywhere, I am still very concerned about how
Safety.
kids get to school.
I agree.
Okay, so I think we have an agenda for next time.
About when?
Yes.
Oh.
Is this This time, unfortunately, does not work for me next week, and I apologize, I have to be at a meeting in Marlborough, Massachusetts at 6 o'clock on next Wednesday.
What you've asked for is going to take some time, so I'm going to say at least 2 weeks before the next meeting.
So actually, that would put us at a 5 o'clock before the next school committee meeting, and perhaps in deference,
Is that too long a day for you folks?
no, that's fine. Steve? Yeah. We're thinking we might do it same time,
The 14th.
The 14th.
but on the 21st. Wait a minute. That's the
So-
14th. No, it's the 14th that I
Today's
can't.
the 29th, the 7th is next week, the
I can't do
14th
it
is
the
the week
7th.
after, where there's no school.
Okay, it's the 14th I can't do. The 7th we could do, but you can't.
I really can't, if we can change the day, if you don't mind, because I have a meeting on the 6th and the,
Before the school board meeting.
I think to give, this is a serious meeting in terms of preparation, to give both Mark and Jeff and Barry and Anna maximum time for a serious presentation about Plan B that I hope everybody tunes in for. I don't think pushing it off till the 21st, if that works for everybody as a date, is a bad,
unless we could meet later. Do you have a school committee meeting on the 21st?
yeah.
Yes.
What about Monday, the 19th? You can't do it. Okay, that's all right. We'll figure it
Is
out.
Tuesday any better? No, how about Tuesday at 5, though, before your meeting?
Which day?
The 20th?
The 20th?
Yep.
Yes? And that works well for Steve, because he's already going to be here for your meeting.
I won't, somebody will.
Somebody will.
5 p.m. on the 20th.
5
It's a Tuesday.
Correct. Yes. And you will talk to Mark about his part of the agenda,
Yes, I will.
and Jeff and Barry are here. On that note, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
1 second. She seconded, but I'm not going to vote yet. What about minutes for these meetings?
Oh,
I've been
Michelle has been,
struggling this.
would you ask Michelle to send them to people?
Yes.
Do we get a disc for this, Steve?
Yeah, $14.95.
Get lost.
Actually, $19.95.
And it'll go into the transportation revolver, right,
There you
Steve?
go.
Here you go.
Mr. White said he'll do it for free.
See him here.
He's here.
He's in the back.
Yeah, you get it, Des.
Okay,
I don't want it.
Aye.
good to go? We are adjourned. Thank you.